Добрый вечер. В эфире программа «Первая студия». Меня зовут Горчинская Екатерина, и у нас в гостях сегодня очень важный и очень интересный гость. Это глава офиса ООН в Украине Ніл Вокер. Welcome to the show. And I know you arrived to Ukraine about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, and one of the first issues that you mentioned was that Ukraine was way behind on humanitarian issues and handling the war and the humanitarian effort that is supposed to come as a part of the warfare or as after the warfare. Has Ukraine caught up?
Well, I'd like to be able to say that we've caught up. We've made enormous progress, but there's still huge amounts to do, and there's problems on both sides. It's fair to say that Ukraine hasn't had a history of dealing with major emergencies. You don't have typhoons, you don't have earthquakes, and I think there was a lot of reluctance to even acknowledge the reality of a humanitarian situation caused by war and conflict. But having started, the process is moving. What are some of the issues that we face? We have problems both in what we call the non-government controlled areas as well as on this side. From this side, the restrictions on freedom of movement really aggravate the crisis on the other side. It's very difficult for people to move across the border. It's very difficult for supplies and commercial traffic to move across the border. Those are restrictions imposed on this side that directly affect the humanitarian situation on the other side. On the other side, with the self-proclaimed de facto authorities, we have difficulty. We have no permission to work, no permission to provide humanitarian operations. There's a couple of small exceptions. ICRC is operational in some parts, and People in Need is another organization that's operational. The vast majority of humanitarian organizations have not been given authority to work. What this means?
I noticed in your latest report there was a very emotional line or even paragraph in the conclusions about the fact that you're not getting permissions on the other side to operate. I mean, how big of a problem is that, and how much does it cripple your effort?
It stops us cold, frankly, and it's a serious issue. We estimate there are some 3 million people facing severe humanitarian needs, worsening with the winter. Now, these are on both sides. You probably have 2 million of those just right along either side of the contact line, or the touch line, as we call it. And these are the most vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they don't want to move farther away, because they don't have the resources, and or they still have family on the other side, either side. And generally, they're the ones that face the most difficult circumstances. With these numbers, with the winter upon us, the action needed to have begun already. We have a pipeline, 16,000 metric tons of food and supplies ready to move into non-government controlled areas, and we are, as I said, we are stopped.
Is the government of Ukraine helping you at all to solve this problem?
Yeah, actually, I mean, as I said, we're the only specific issue that I have right now with the government is this issue of the freedom of movement. But otherwise, we get enormous support from the government at all different levels. We're working with the President's administration, with the Prime Minister, with the Vice Prime Minister, with the state emergency services, as well as with key partners such as even the SBU has been very supportive in terms of revising the ATO Act in order to help us to move goods. I would argue that in the past year that I've been here, we've seen significant improvements in the levels of coordination that we have with the government in terms of addressing humanitarian needs.
What about on the other side? I mean, you have complained about issues with registration, yet we're seeing a lot of Russian humanitarian convoys, or so-called humanitarian convoys, crossing the border from that side. Are they registered? Do they have a registration?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way in which the de facto authorities are presenting this, it's really hard for us to fully understand how that's operational. They are delivering directly to the de facto authorities. Therefore, they're not distributing humanitarian aid. They're not carrying out humanitarian action. As such, the de facto authorities say that doesn't require registration. They're simply delivering.
Why can't you do that?
Because, in fact, our concern is to ensure that humanitarian assistance is reaching only the most vulnerable. In such a circumstance, especially when there's armed groups, it's critical for the United Nations and other humanitarian actors to ensure that the humanitarian assistance is not supporting armed groups, whatever their particular politics or their position may be, we don't provide humanitarian assistance to armed groups. We provide it to vulnerable people. In this particular crisis, there's far more old people needing humanitarian assistance than any other crisis I have ever worked in. For instance, a specific characteristic of the crisis here. But unless we have the confidence that the food is going and the medicine is going to hospitals, orphanages, homes for the elderly, people who are living in villages that are far away and remote from the center, unless we have that confidence, in fact, it's not humanitarian assistance.
And how do you choose those people? I mean, do you have people on the ground? Can you walk us through the process?
We have very clear criteria. I mean, we actually do a fairly comprehensive needs assessment on the ground. More than 60 such studies have been done in the past 8 months, this year, let's just say this year. And right now, the humanitarian actors are coming together next week, next Tuesday, to consolidate the information in these assessments regarding what are the actual needs in, for instance, shelter, roofing supplies, windows, etc., tarpaulins. In terms of medicines, we've looked at what medicines are actually available, what are the critical needs for medicines. Again, looking at the specifics in Ukraine, we're talking about more needs for diabetic medicine, high blood pressure medicine than we see, for instance, in other crisis contexts.
So, and TB, I suppose,
and
as
TB,
well.
absolutely,
TB is
ARVs.
a big problem, I believe.
TB, drug-resistant TB, is a critical issue, as is HIV/AIDS, and the lack of availability of the drugs that deal with these issues simply causes a severe aggravation of the issues of tuberculosis as well as of HIV.
So how many humanitarian convoys? I guess you don't call them that, right? But humanitarian supplies have you had in the East?
We actually, well, I'm not going to break it down. We look at the humanitarian need on both sides, and in fact, we can provide the statistics if you're interested. We can. I don't distinguish personally between either side of the border, but what we've delivered so far is assistance to approximately 2 million people over the past year. This is in terms of food, shelter, medicines, as well as protection for those people who are suffering from violence associated with the conflict, trauma of children, as well as gender-based violence. These are the kinds of support that we've provided. As I say, probably more than 2 million people we have reached so far.
But I guess humanitarian effort is not the only one in Donbass that you have, not the only kind of engagement that you've got. And in fact, Ukraine has been wanting more, and recently the president of Ukraine said that he would like a peacekeeping force from the United Nations there on the ground. Well, personally, I interpreted it as a bit of a wishful thinking, because I don't think it's particularly feasible to have both OSCE and the UN peacekeeping force on the ground. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, thank you, Katya, for sort of broadening it, and I think it's really helpful to look at the history of Ukraine in the United Nations since 70 years ago. As you know, we spoke about this. We're celebrating on the 24th of October. We're celebrating 70 years of the United Nations. Ukraine was there at the founding, but especially since 1992, we've had a very active presence on the ground, building communities, building government institutions. The support we've provided has changed radically since the Maidan revolution of dignity, I think as I prefer to call it. For me, the relevance of the United Nations in this particular national context, it's astounding. It's really, for me, it's inspirational. It's an opportunity for Ukrainians to really see the United Nations in a different way. Think Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1945. It was almost an afterthought. Now it constitutes common international law, and all of the conventions that have come out of it are, in fact, based and sound as if international law. And this is a powerful force in the current context. If you think, for instance, the Human Rights Mission was the first response of the United Nations to the crisis, sent by the Secretary General in March of last year. Since then, the reporting by the Human Rights Mission has been the only objective reporting that isn't pure propaganda or partial propaganda that exists on what's actually happening. Forced disappearances, torture, executions, shellings of innocent civilians, unexploded ordnance. All of these are cataloged. And as that mission moves forward, it's even looking for accountability in terms of Where did that happen? How did that happen? Who caused that? And requesting the authorities to carry out investigations. That's a powerful force for the problems facing the country. But it isn't that. We've spoken about the humanitarian. We also need to speak, more importantly, about early recovery, jobs, livelihoods. This is, in 25 years...
We will move forward to the jobs and
Okay.
even the human rights violations. I would like to get back to the history of the relationship between Ukraine and the UN. And as you probably know, that there are a lot of grumbles in Ukraine about the actual role the UN has played in providing solutions in this conflict, because there is a growing dissatisfaction in Ukraine that UN is extremely is not reacting in the way that we expect, is not effective in its reactions, it's not quick enough, and Russia has too much of a say in that.
Well, I think the only area where you could argue of any possible frustrations is at the level of the Security Council. And let's be frank, the Security Council is built in a certain way. The Security Council, for instance, was unable to stop the American invasion of Iraq. Okay? The Security Council is not built in a way to address certain kinds of crises. I still think you cannot underestimate the power of what is the voice of the Security Council. There have been 35 meetings of the Security Council on Ukraine alone in the past year, in that the member states have expressed incredible solidarity with Ukraine with regards to the situation that you face in the conflict, as well as with regards to Crimea. There was a General Assembly resolution passed respecting the territorial integrity of Ukraine pre-crisis. These are powerful symbols of moral support. And at the end of the day, the most recent decision, vote, if you will, by the General Assembly, 177 countries voted to put Ukraine as a non-permanent member on the Security Council. Ukraine will have its own voice in the Security Council.
So what sort of benefit do you think is going to give Ukraine?
Well, I think that the support of the world is a pretty significant support. I think it's a powerful incentive for Ukraine to address the needs. Look, let's be frank. In a military conflict in Ukraine, NATO is not going to come.
No chance.
U.S. Marines are not going to come.
No chance.
And even peacekeeping was never built for the kind of defense that Ukraine needs for itself. The answer is Ukraine must address the needs of reform, the needs of development, okay, as well as the humanitarian crisis that you face. This is yours to address. This will be your achievement. There is such potential in this country. 25 years, I've never worked in a country this wealthy. Okay, I'm coming from the Sudans, the Bangladeshis, okay, the Equatorial Guineas of the world. But for 25 years, this process of reform and development, of standing on your own, has been frustrated by a series of bad governments and, frankly, apathy amongst the population.
Yes.
My optimism comes, if I could just finish this thought, my optimism for this country comes out of the end of apathy that is so powerfully reflected in the spirit of Maidan and the revolution of dignity.
Yes, I was struck by one of the quotes that I read from you as of April this year, when you said that it's incredible how big a potential Ukraine has, but also it's incredible how big of a challenge it's facing. What are those challenges, and do you think Ukraine is handling them well?
Well, I actually do. I'm really optimistic. Maybe it's a job requirement that goes along with my position in the United Nations, but I'm actually quite optimistic about what Ukraine is doing and what it can do. But it is fair to say that the challenges are really deep and broad. You have, of course, the security situation in the Donbass. You have the humanitarian crisis. You have the need to get people back to work, jobs, vocational training, changing the economic industrial model. And then, of course, you have the need for real reform of the state. Until Ukrainians have a state which is accountable, transparent, and effective, the revolution, the spirit of the revolution of Maidan will be unmet.
let's go into the accountability issue and back to the war zone. I mean, in your report, it's very, very clear from your report that Ukrainians are not punishing anyone for war crimes, or if they do, it's a very light punishment. It's usually not for actual violations of human rights, but it's about trespassing and crimes like that. Do you think the Ukrainian government's reactions have improved or have gone worse since the beginning of this conflict? How are they handling the violations of human rights?
Well, actually, I think it's important to look at the violations of human rights case by case, issue by issue. We have actually had response from the government on a number of issues when there have been specific reports of militias, volunteer militias, and abuses by those individual militia. There have been responses by the government, and I think that it's fair to say that these are difficult issues. It isn't only about the violations as they occur, it's about the longer-term issues of reconciliation and social cohesion. And here you need to think about how to invest in community development that enables communities to address the trauma that they've suffered. I'm actually fairly optimistic that the government is not just reading our reports, but taking action on them.
It's interesting that you're talking about longer-term sort of tasks and reconciliation. I'm just wondering if the government is even thinking long-term like that, because from your report it's pretty obvious that right now on the ground there are volunteer battalions that are committing crimes and violating human rights. Even the State Security Service is mentioned a few times in your report as perpetrators of these crimes. So do you really think that the government is handling this issue and is looking forward into rebuilding the dialogue with Donbass?
Yeah, no, I do. I do believe that. I think that it's a very complicated scenario, and that you can't just sort of paint a big brush over it. You need to look at the details, and I don't think this program is necessarily the place to do that, quite frankly. But what I will say is that we have confidence that when we speak to the government about specific issues and specific violations, that we see action. That's really important, and I think that that's what you need to focus on.
In your latest report, there is an estimate of the number of victims of this war, and the number of 7,883 people.
Those are deaths alone, by the way.
Deaths alone, and more than 17,000 casualties.
Right.
How has the figure changed since the report came out?
Well, for one thing, we have a relatively viable ceasefire. I think you know, the decline in deaths since the ceasefire has become fundamentally viable over the past maybe 6 weeks. This is a huge achievement. Ukraine will really only be able to achieve its potential if it's operating in an environment where there is no open war. Now the deaths are more related to unexploded ordnance, occasional mines. There are issues of disappearances occasionally, but this is a very different kind of casualty than what we see, you know, what we saw when there was constant shelling. This enables us to initiate work around mine action. What we call mine action means teaching children and civilians about the risks of unexploded ordnance, recognizing where there's mines potentially laid and beginning the process of squaring off those areas and or removing those mines. These are early days. The conflict is barely over. In fact, you know, if you were to look back at the work we've done with the government, one of the most visionary elements is that we've been speaking about recovery and jobs even from earlier this year, saying the conflict must end. It will end. There's pressure, there's global pressure, there's national momentum. The conflict must end. Therefore, how are we going to get beyond that to get people back to their lives? It isn't just returning them to a home, because the home has no windows, it has no roof. It entails...
There might be no home at all.
There might be no home at all, exactly. It may well mean relocation and or restarting with vocational training, with adjusting the skills that one has. I must tell you that I've been extraordinarily impressed with the volunteerism and the solidarity that the Ukrainians themselves show. We spoke about this even last year when we first met the first time. And we see that more than ever. And what gives the United Nations particular pride is to work with those kinds of national partners, NGOs, small civil organizations. And with these groups, we're able to help people figure out their lives. Do they stay in the eastern part of the country? Do they return to non-government controlled areas? Do they come to Kiev or go as far as Lviv? And if they do, what sort of jobs do they need? What sort of adjustments do they need? And I think that all of this we have to begin to look at as quickly as possible, because the worst scenario in my mind is a peace which is then surrounded by devastation, trauma, and a stalled economy.
Going back to the casualty figures, I frequently hear complaints that international numbers produced by you or other agencies are extremely underestimated. A lot of journalists on the ground report the same thing, that your casualty numbers are way too low. How do you assess your own casualty numbers?
We say they're probably too low.
What would be the difference?
The issue is that we only report on what we can absolutely verify. And so we are sure that it is this many, and we are also sure that it's probably more. It says right in the report, it's very clear, these are probably conservative figures, but they are figures about which we are certain. And I think that it's just an indication. At the end of the day, every life matters, and every day lost is another tragedy. But I think that our effort is to simply focus on what we can say absolutely certain, we can verify, we know who this person actually is.
But what would be your guesstimate?
None. On that one, sorry, none.
Okay, well, let's go back to the mines issue. I've heard a statistic that a year of military conflict means about 10 years of demining in the area. Ukraine has had the conflict for nearly 2 years. So does that mean that in 20 years the land will be clear, and what does it take to get there?
It's a long road. It's a long road. What I can say is that one major contribution that Ukraine has made over the past 20 years is to the United Nations peacekeeping efforts around the world. There's some 50,000 Ukrainian servicemen, servicewomen have served in both police and peacekeeping missions. A big part of that, by the way, has been support to mine action and demining in peacekeeping missions around the world.
So what you're saying is we have quite a lot of experience.
Exactly. You have the capacity, you have the inherent national capacity that needs to be, of course, somehow strengthened, revitalized, and focused on this particular issue. But I'm confident that if this becomes a clear national priority, as it must, then the Ukraine, with some support from the international community, can do this on its own.
Are you seeing this effort for tapping into this experience and organizing a massive sort of demining campaign?
Yeah, it's very early days. It's very early days. One of the critical elements of this discussion, in my view, is trust. If you were to look at the Minsk talks and you were to look at the security working group, they have been negotiating, for instance, around the withdrawal of heavy weapons. And there's been light weapons and heavy weapons. And in fact, there's been some excellent success. If you speak to the people behind that, what they've said has been the hardest to achieve is to gain trust between these two sides. And these first steps of pulling back equipment are, in fact, a reflection of incipient, fragile trust. Demining is down the road on that trust, because at the end of the day, I see it as a humanitarian. I see it as a protection issue, protection of civilian, of children. If you're an untrusting military individual, you might see it as a defense. So what I'm telling you is that we are beginning to make progress, and the progress that the security working group has made around withdrawal of light and medium and heavy weapons is in fact the precursor to the next step, was now let's talk about demining.
Yes, I often laugh at all these withdrawal efforts when I read the statements from the Ukrainian government that, well, we just withdrew so-and-so, but it would take us an hour to return it. I mean, that doesn't help build trust. And what do you think of statements like that?
I think that this is a very precarious situation. I'm proud that both sides have managed to exhibit enough trust to do what they have done. I'm overjoyed that the ceasefire has held as long as it has held. I sincerely pray that it continues to hold. And I think that's what I can say. This goes beyond my mandate. I'm just speaking as in a way as a friend of Ukraine around these issues. This is not the area where I am working.
Yeah, but let's go back to your job as opposed to your being a friend of Ukraine, and back to the volunteering. I read a very impressive report from the UN about the level of volunteering that Ukraine has compared to other countries, and I realized that about 25% of the population in this report, which was done, I believe, about a year ago, of volunteering. I actually found the figure quite low because at that point I felt there were almost like that almost everyone is volunteering. Have you done anything else to follow up on those figures? Have you got anything else?
I would love to do another study on that, and I would love to see better results. It's hard to measure volunteerism. We found this throughout the world. We do what's called the state of volunteerism around the world every year. Every other year, I think it is. It's produced by the United Nations Volunteers out of Bonn, where their headquarters is, and we find it notoriously difficult to measure volunteerism. Having said that, and I would love to enter into that exercise of looking at what is the level of volunteerism in the country, and I'll be happy to take that forward. But I think perhaps the better focus is on how do we actually promote volunteerism in the national context? How do we support those who have been volunteering now for a year and often without salary or without resources? And this is what I'm encouraging my staff throughout the whole of the United Nations, because we are a many faceted organization, United Nations in Ukraine, to encourage all the agencies, the funds and the programs to work with volunteers and to support incipient and or middle-sized organizations that are volunteering around the causes which we hold dear: human rights, humanitarian action, peace and tolerance, reconciliation, jobs and livelihoods.
Do you have any success stories of cooperation with the newly established sort of volunteering efforts in Ukraine and international organizations?
Yeah, there's a number of excellent organizations that give me great pride. I want to say the name of one in particular, but I'm not positive I'm going to get it right. It's the Free People's Job Center is what I think it is. We visited this recently. I may have the name wrong. I have to check it. But the work that they're doing is really inspirational. You have to see they've lined up matching between companies that are willing to provide different kinds of support. Some companies are willing to provide vocational training for those people that they're focusing on IDPs, by the way, on IDPs. And there are companies which are willing to provide some kind of vocational training. Subsequently, they would offer jobs. There are other companies which are willing to come in and simply say, I will give you some money and please help, set up your network, do something with it. So the organization is kind of like almost like the hub of a network.
Yeah, like a platform where everyone...
Exactly. So the IDPs know that they can call here. They can come in. They will find volunteer counselors who say, well, what do? You have a PhD in history? That's, what are we going to do with you,
yes,
right?
What do you do with your hands?
Right. Maybe you've been working in a coal mine. What are your skills? And to try and help these people think through creatively what they actually might do in a different city, in a different town, to start over again. And then matching them with potential training and or with companies. This kind of work for me is really inspirational. You have to visit these places as often as you can.
So where does the cooperation with international organizations come in?
Well, we've been providing seed funding that enables them to get started, okay? And we've been able to provide them with some technical assistance just in terms of how these things work. How do you set up a network? How do you set up a platform? Small amounts of funding and the coverage of their rental space for a year. These are the kinds of things which it's not big money. It's what it is it's critical money.
So where does most of your budget go to nowadays?
Well, boy, that's a good question. I mean, the Human Rights Mission, we have reporting every few months. We have humanitarian action, where we've spent by now about $150 million on humanitarian supplies that are delivered to people throughout the country, primarily along the touchline.
Yeah.
And then we have a number of major programs, whether you're talking about WHO and the polio campaign, UNICEF, also the polio campaign. We're doing tuberculosis drugs. We're doing community-based development. These are the kinds of areas where the UN has real strength. The community-based approach.
But that's outside of Donbass, right? That's across the nation.
All of this is across the nation. I mean, I try and focus the humanitarian work is in the eastern part of the country. The development and recovery is nationwide. The reform is focused primarily on Kiev. We're also helping with the National Action Plan for Human Rights and its implementation. So if you look, let me try and be a little clearer, okay? Let's talk about reform at the national level, whether it's judiciary reform, parliamentary reform, or human rights action plan and legislation. This kind of support United Nations is doing here in Kiev. You talk about national development and recovery, jobs, livelihoods, economic development, community services in health and education across the country. You're talking about what we call the IDPs. It's focused primarily along the government-controlled sections of the eastern regions.
And if you're talking, I guess that's the greatest concentration of them is there, right?
Absolutely. Well, there are quite a few of. Well, no, the vast majority is there. You find a few hundred here, a few hundred there, but the vast majority, over 1 million, is still in the east. And then, of course, there's humanitarian action. So if you're looking at how the UN is spending its money, you have to look across this full panorama of action.
Going back to your report, there is a line that struck me in the report that says you're observing institutional development of the self-proclaimed republics, the LNR and DNR. They're issuing passports, they're establishing their judiciary, their ministries, etc., etc. So what is your assessment of what it means for the potential for reconciliation, of which you're one of the drivers?
It's a complicated situation. It's really difficult to predict how this will evolve. I think it's important to highlight that the United Nations position is driven by the General Assembly resolution, which recognizes the territorial integrity of the country. I think it's fair to say that even Russia, on a number of occasions, has encouraged the separatists in the east to deal with the government in Kiev under a single Ukrainian solution. It's also fair to say that the de facto authorities are taking actions to institute, to institute life, to organize life, and that's a fact that will take some management over time. I think that at the end of the day, we need to also eliminate the restrictions on movement, so that eventually this region, this area which is not controlled by the government, doesn't, in a way, become a separate country simply because of the walls that Ukraine builds. If Ukraine builds walls which don't allow people to pass, which don't allow goods to pass, which don't allow freedom of movement as is enshrined in international law, then by definition, you create a de facto state, whether that's the policy or whether that's the intention or not.
Yes, I have noticed that there is a lot of criticism from international organizations and, in fact, within Ukraine of the government policy of restriction of movement and creating these so-called corridors where people, sometimes have to walk for kilometers to get to the next bus because there is no communication and public transport between across the contact line. Is the government listening to this criticism? Is the policy changing?
It's hard for me to assess that. I mean, it's something that is there, and the lines continue. And I would like to think that the government is listening, and we've had some revisions of the ATO orders that facilitate freedom of movement. But so far, we haven't seen that translate into actual freedom of movement. And I think that I would like to suggest that the logistical hubs that the government has set up constitute a powerful political statement. Look, we are here. We are trying to provide our assistance. We don't control the territory over there, so here we can put goods, and if you can get out, they're here for you to take. I think that that's a powerful statement. I think it's what the government can do. It isn't what we need to do, because from our side, we actually need to be inside non-government controlled areas, and we need to deliver, and we need to monitor that delivery. We need to ensure its distribution to most vulnerable. I think that in addition to the logistical hubs, if the government were to open up the movement across these lines, that it would significantly alleviate humanitarian stress, and I think that it would. I think it would contribute to. I think it would contribute to a sense of support and unity in the country.
If you were to dream big and design a policy for the Ukrainian government, taking into account all of your experience of reconciliation and sustainable development of that area, what would be your big dream for Donbass in like steps?
How much time do you have, Katya?
About 4 minutes.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that the elements include first ensuring the peace along the contact line, ensuring that ceasefire holds, and that takes trust. It entails risk. If you are going to trust me, you can't tell if I'm going to trust you. You can't tell how that's going to work out. I would encourage the government to take that risk, to trust along the peace line and to hold the ceasefire. I would also encourage them to recognize the needs of all citizens. By the way, on this we get real support from President and Prime Minister and a number of other key officials in the government. I don't hear this rhetoric that these are not our citizens. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are obstacles. But this policy of recognizing all citizens is powerful. They are all our citizens. We need to support all of them. Then the issues of reconciliation, trust, and support to IDPs. You need to find balanced support to communities that includes both support to the host communities as well as to the IDPs. Reform. At the end of the day, I have to conclude with reform. Unless the issue of impunity, judicial independence, rule of law, respect for human rights, unless these fundamentals of good governance are not fixed, and this is a longer-term agenda, but you have to start step by step. A national agenda, because at the end of the day, the strongest position of defense for Ukraine is one in which the country is strong, it is democratic, it is ruled by clear accountability, rules of law, and an independent judiciary. These are the issues which will make a strong Ukraine and will clearly give it a path towards the European Union if this is what the people want.
Okay. What would be your biggest gripe about the Ukrainian government policy in Donbass? There are a lot of gripes in the UN reports, particularly of arbitrary decisions by the battalions, by the local authorities, et cetera, but what is the biggest problem that needs the most urgent solution?
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying that we count on good relations and good support with the government, so I don't want to focus overly on complaints, but I do think the issue of freedom of movement right now is perhaps the most critical issue that we need to get addressed in the East. We understand there are security concerns, but we do believe that more can be done to ensure freedom of movement of people and goods across the touchline.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation. Это программа «Первая студия», и у нас в гостях был глава ООН в Украине Нил Вокер. Спасибо и до свидания.
Thank you very much.